Eckhart is one of the founding members of the Association of Adaptation Studies too, and he's very modest about his role in that. And he's played a huge part in the development of that association. And it was great fun in the early days. Like, it always reminded me of Ocean's 11, because we would meet in different parts of the world. And it was some of the people that I really wanted to know, and bringing them together was just a joy. Okay, well, I'm hoping to talk for about half an hour. And I'm completely out of my comfort zone. So I'll be really eager to hear any criticism at the end of this, because I'm just working on this now. It's very much a work in progress. And I kind of was thinking the other day, I don't know why I said I would do this, because I still feel that it's very much in preparation. And it's part of a bid that I'm making to see how we can use an adaptation approach to understand the legacy of a historical figure, in this case, Richard III. And I'm working with the King Richard III Visitor Centre in Leicester, a colleague in Nottingham who's currently editing an edition of Shakespeare's Richard III, and an archaeologist at the University of Leicester who was part of the team that excavated the remains of Richard in 2012. So it's like very much a kind of East Midlands project. And I want to locate Richard within the context of franchise adaptation, and like a lucratively successful adaptationist, if you like, or a Hollywood producer or a museum curator, explore what are Richard's unique selling points, his USPs, and how these are adapted for changing audiences. This extends my notion of adaptation as commercialization or merchandising. It's an approach that focuses on the consumer rather than the subject. And I've been writing quite a lot about adaptation as marketing. In particular, the paper is going to consider Laurence Olivier's portrayal of Richard in 1955 as kind of somehow clinching a long-standing adaptation formula. He manages to make his Richard today the most authentic of Richard III adaptations, almost an original in itself. So, as you know, adaptations is breaking boundaries, and that's the theme of this seminar series. And it's only recently ventured into these territories which were previously untouchable. And one of those areas that we haven't really explored until quite recently is the adaptation of people in film studies, referred to as biopics, in history, biography, in creative writing, biofiction. And I mean, all of these historically are names which, when we invoke them, usually serve to discredit or cheapen the work, and are rarely used when a text is considered, a work is considered a classic, such as Shakespeare's Richard III. And critics resist referring to Shakespeare's play as biographical fiction or biographical drama, or they resist talking about the films of Richard III as biopics. And I just wanted to ask the question, why not? Why can't we talk about these as biopics? And I also wanted to think about what we call Richard's other paratexts. And living in Leicester, I'm surrounded by Richard III. And you can see on the left-hand side, Richard III has been adopted by our local football club, Leicester City Football Club, who are sponsored by King Power. And the city itself has been kind of transformed by the discovery of Richard. You see him everywhere. And I just have a couple of images here to indicate that. You can see there's a pub that's called the Last Plantagenet, which is just on the kind of outskirts of the city centre. So what do we call Richard's other paratexts? Can we call some of the sites in Leicester adaptations of Richard, such as the car park sign, which instructs vehicle owners, no bearing dead monarchs here, or a pub named the Last Plantagenet? And what about the Richard III souvenirs? White boar cufflinks, Finding Richard mugs, Richard III t-shirts, all of which can be purchased across Leicester, and in particular in the recently founded King Richard III Visitor Centre. And how is it that the discovery of a medieval king's remains and a rediscovered connection with monarchy can transform a city from relative obscurity into a must-see heritage site? The city itself, while not obviously an adaptation, has had to adapt from the discovery of the remains of the monarch itself. So what draws me to Richard III adaptations is that on the one hand, the monarch has been blatantly used as a source of propaganda and has undergone dramatic transformations over the last 500 years. Whereas on the other hand, there has been an almost obsessive desire to find the real Richard, to pin him down. And these are epitomized in titles such as Al Pacino's film, Looking for Richard, which was released in 1996, or the forthcoming The Lost King, directed by Stephen Frears and starring Steve Coogan. Not to mention the prolonged quest of Richard's fan club, the Richard III Society, which aims to, it's been going for years and years and years, and aims to rescue Richard from negative interpretations. I just got a shot here from the filming of The Lost King. I can hardly wait to see this movie. The Richard III Society is well organized and resourced. It even commissioned a statue of Richard III, which has recently been relocated outside the city's cathedral. The documentary of his excavation, Richard III, The King in the Car Park, made in 2012, weaves together the story of the discovery of the remains with a quest to uncover Richard's real story. Well, the search for the historical truth has long been identified as a noble endeavor. The desire to adapt history is seen as disrespectful, almost sacrilegious. And as academics, we've been conditioned to applaud a historical documentary or discovery while sneering at a biopic. However, the new biopic of Philippa Langley, who was the person behind the quest for Richard, looks to be a story like The Dig, and I don't know if many of you have seen it, but it was a film that came out this year, starring Carey Mulligan and Ralph Fiennes, that sets the amateurs against the academics. It's a kind of anti-university narrative, which champions the uneducated scholar over the so-called expert. It looks to be a biopic that explicitly sneers at academics rather than just turning its back on them. And this is what The Lost King seems to be doing as well. The historical two-pronged or two-faced approach to adaptation, kind of combining an unswerving commitment to authentication with often unbridled fabrication, is typical of the marketing of adaptations of the 20th century. And I'm a real fan of press books of the first half of the 20th century, and I found fascinating insights about adaptation in these kind of Hollywood press books. And to borrow from the epigraph of Linda Hutchin and Gary Bortolotti's article on the origins of adaptations, promoters or developers or creators of popular adaptations have a primary aim, I think, to try, this is a quote from their epigraph, to try to figure out how to thrive in the world. That's the function of a popular adaptation. When speaking of adaptations, the press books from 1927 to the late 1950s adopt this twofold approach in their attempt to satisfy all audiences so that the movies can thrive financially. First of all, this is a press book from Richard III, which shot Olivier's film in 1955, which I'll return to. But you can see how they're kind of they're designed. First of all, the press books employ academic experts, stressing the fidelity to detail in the accuracy of costumes, sets, school tie-ins, and often associations with the author. And they also do, secondly, I guess, their utmost to reassure audiences with cartoons, marketing tricks, sexy captions, the films are wildly unlike their highbrow source. In other words, the press books shamelessly contradict themselves in their aim to appeal to the highest and the lowest, in inverted commas, denominators. And I've read hundreds of these press books, and they all approach adaptations in this particular way. On one hand, they say, yippee, this is the most authentic thing you've ever seen. And secondly, it doesn't resemble the source in any way whatsoever. So adaptation is, as I previously noted, another word for marketing. And this is helpful in understanding an adaptation franchise. And in Richard III's case, one that spans over 500 years. The reluctance among literary or film study scholars to adopt this approach is possibly because marketing and commercializing has a bad name. It's the act of popularizing, cheapening, or reducing a source in order to profit from it. And there's a long-standing tradition in our culture that money and art don't mix. And in the medieval period, however, money was key to self-promotion and the validation of national celebrities such as Richard III. So Richard himself, like his royal predecessors, promoted himself through his buildings and his branding. His castles present an image of imposing power and wealth, and his brand. I'll just go through some of the castles. In my project, we're going to be doing virtual tours of these castles to see how Richard's kind of brand is present here. But his brand is actually the white boar, an image of purity, but also perhaps unintentionally of greed and violent aggression, something to both admire and fear. In the period immediately following Richard's death, Richard became disabled. This has been a significant meme in adaptations to follow, another USP, unique selling point, in the marketing of Richard. And what is striking from my perspective today is the link between evil and deformity, something that perhaps, again, following Richard III's portrayal, became a part of the horror genre, with the villain disabled or becoming disabled through the process of a film. And the obvious example is, of course, The Shining. Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson in The Shining, becomes incrementally disabled as his evil increases in the movie. And in the final moments, he appears disheveled, hunchbacked, and limping, resembling the classic horror villain, or even possibly Richard III. So the progress of Richard's afterlife, particularly in the Tudor period, uncannily resembles the progress of a typical horror genre villain. Richard's portrait in the early 16th century has been demonstrated to have been repainted. His expression has become more severe, his shoulders more uneven than in the original portrait. It was painted over. And the disabling of him is another way of demonizing him. And it can be seen in the progress of Richard III following the defeat at the Battle of Bosworth. It's well known to students of Shakespeare that Tudor historians were keen to vindicate Henry VII's claim to Richard's throne by making the defeated monarch unequivocally evil. John Roos was probably one of the first to introduce Richard's disability. He wrote a history of the Earls of Warwick in the lifetime of Richard, which was revised after Richard's defeat at Bosworth. So in the Tudor version, Roos adds more detail about Richard, describing his birth as unnatural. We're told that he was born after 2 years in the womb, and he was born with teeth and hair, and with uneven shoulders. Thomas More is probably one of the most famous depictions of Richard. He describes him as little of stature, ill-featured of limbs, crook-backed, malicious, wrathful, envious, and he goes on and on. This is endorsed by Raphael Holinshed, one of Shakespeare's sources. And Holinshed again elaborates on the deformities of Richard. He was small and little of stature, so was he of body greatly deformed. the one shoulder higher than the other. His face was small, but his countenance cruel, and such that the first aspect of a man would judge it to savour and smell of malice, fraud, and deceit. I've been reading quite a lot about the Richard III Society, and I did meet the Richard III Society too in my preparation for this application. And they're really upset that, Richard is described as being short, and they go to, huge lengths. It's quite strange to prove that he was not that short. He was only seen to be short because his brother, Edward IV, was so tall. Edward IV was notoriously over 6 feet tall. But they're trying to rescue, as much as possible, Richard from all of these, what they call slanders. It's a very interesting group of people. In the True Tragedy of Richard III, which is an earlier Tudor play about the king, the figure of truth tells us that Richard is a man ill-shaped, crook-backed, lame-armed, withal valiantly minded, but tyrannous in authority. So during the minority of the young Brits, he is made Lord Protector over the realm. So if we see bioadaptations as twofold, on one hand striving for historical accuracy, and on the other flying in the face of the facts, then Shakespeare, following in the footsteps of his Tudor predecessors, is firmly more concerned with fiction than fact, in deviation over fidelity. In fact, Shakespeare seems to have taken this approach to the ultimate extreme, making Richard guilty of the death of his brother George, Duke of Clarence, when there's no record of his involvement in it. In Shakespeare, Richard marries Anne Neville over the coffin of her father-in-law, who died in 1471, when it was most likely a year later, 1472, almost a decade before Richard was crowned king. And of course, Shakespeare makes Richard completely responsible for the deaths of the princes in the Tower. So you can see this kind of tradition of making Richard, even worse, going forward into the 20th century, Laurence Olivier's film, replacing the wooing of her Anne's husband's rather than her father-in-law's coffin to further increase Richard's perversity. The liberty with the truth, especially unequivocally presenting a real person as a murderer when in life they weren't quite so bad, would have been beyond the pale for screenwriters of biopics in the 20th and 21st centuries, when historians howled with pain over the historical inaccuracies. But their liberties with the truth seem minor compared to those of Shakespeare. Olivier capitalizes on the Tudor mind-body parallel with a tagline in his film, "His mind and deeds were as twisted as his body." This is the press book. However, Shakespeare's presentation of the relatively recently deceased king seems an audacious act of disrespect, especially if the medieval and early modern period, especially in the medieval and modern period, when in life those individuals invested so much in their posthumous reputations, especially through the commissioning of tombs, a type of self-adaptation, or Shakespeare's, in Shakespeare's words, a monument without a tomb. And we can see that in the case of Richard, his monument is made to be viciously fictional, disrespectful, even libelous through these adaptations. Shakespeare's play, like biopics today, is about performance, with Shakespeare's star actor Richard Burbage being renowned for his performance of the monarch. It was his favourite role, allegedly. And of all the history plays, Richard III offers an actor a role that ranges from the extreme of comedy and tragedy, inviting virtuoso performances. There's no doubting the influence it has had in consolidating a popular conception of the king, which flies in the face of historical veracity. Shakespeare's play is almost rivaled in the 20th century in the adaptation of Laurence Olivier, which was released in mid-century in 1955. While Olivier was nominated for an Academy Award for his portrayal of Richard, the adaptation of the play didn't receive the acclaim that his two earlier Shakespeare films did. It's possibly because it was released simultaneously in cinemas and on television, and that the emphasis was more on the performance than on its innovative cinematography. As a review in Variety notes, it's mainly a performance picture, so it doesn't have the kind of virtuoso effects of his earlier Henry V or Hamlet. The set design shows no attempt at realism, with the Tower of London and Westminster seemingly side by side, and with the Battle of Bosworth filmed in the parched Spanish countryside, looking nothing like rural Leicestershire. It follows on the heels of the most successful Hollywood Shakespeare film, which is the 1953 Julius Caesar, in which Marlon Brando, the star, becomes the main selling point. In fact, just before the shooting, the financial backer of London Films, Richard Dowling, sent Olivia a Western Union cablegram stating that England will show Hollywood what it can do as against Caesar. Caesar kind of temporarily overtook Olivier's earlier films. It was seen as the best Shakespeare adaptation ever. Like Brando's Julius Caesar, Richard III can be understood as a star adaptation, two-faced, both about Olivier and Shakespeare's Richard III. As Salvador Dali, who was a member of the sort of earlier version of the Richard III Society, the Friends of Richard III, Olivier astutely illustrated Olivier in 1955, looking two ways, like a typical Hollywood biopic. The film is about the historical Richard III, as Shakespeare would have him, and about the star playing him, as you can see from Olivier's portrait. Olivier identified with Richard III's rise and fall during this period of his life, especially as his reputation had just waned with the collapse of his marriage to Vivian Leigh. Additionally, the promotional materials demonstrate Olivier drawing on his own previous performances, promising the film to be a culmination of and equivalent to his earlier Shakespeare adaptations. The composition of at least two of the Olivier Richard III posters are clearly reminiscent of the earlier Shakespeare promotions, Hamlet in 1948 and Richard. So Hamlet in 1948, if you look on the right-hand side, and Richard are positioned holding swords aloft with a similar lurid orange background. Henry V, released in 1944, and Richard, if you look on the left-hand side of the slide, are presented on white horses, charging heroically from left to right across the chaotic battlefield. The design of the posters clearly draws on the earlier Shakespeare films, informing audiences that if they enjoyed the earlier movies, they will enjoy this one too, making the movie a Shakespeare and, I guess, making the movie a Richard III, Shakespeare and Olivier adaptation. The shadow effects used throughout Olivier's Richard III to call attention to the star's previous repertoire of performances, but they also invoke the horror genre, in which the villain's shadow prefigures the character's presence, suggesting the dark shadow he casts over all around him. The trope is really familiar to cinemagoers, especially in relation to the portrayal of Nosferatu or Dracula in the film in 1922 and 1931. Olivier was expected to make another film, Macbeth, which never happened, probably due to the low box office takings of Richard III. But even the forthcoming film, not just the previous films, is alluded to in the Richard III posters, in the promise that the film will stay in the memory like a bloodstain you can't rub out. Think about the bloody hands of Lady Macbeth. The statement is prophetic insofar as Olivier's portrayal of Richard, although not receiving the same accolades of the earlier films, is arguably the most enduring of all his films, like a bloodstain you can't rub out. With the performance of Richard, one which we keep returning to through subsequent fictional representations of villainy and in historic accounts of the medieval king. The performance of which can be seen in relation to the choice of producer, Alexander Korda, whose reputation was clinched with The Private Life of Henry VIII, which was released in 1933, in which Charles Laughton's portrayal of Henry becomes the authentic, in inverted commas, version of the Tudor king. The marketing of Korda's film mixed history and romance with allusions to the horror genre via Dracula as well. And you can have a look at the press book. I've got a link to that, and I can share these slides with you after this session. The mixture of horror, romance, and historical veracity is similarly employed to market Richard III. And as Charles Laughton became Henry, or Henry became Laughton, Olivier concretized Richard into what seems to be the authentic image. The adaptation becomes a source through the process of bioadaptation. Olivier's portrayal arguably usurps all earlier images of Richard III, and by source here I mean the go-to representation. So we've seen a few earlier versions of Richard. It's this one that seems to stick in our cultural memory. The Richard III press book repeatedly stresses the film's appeal to everyone, typical of the mid-20th century press book marketing of classic adaptations, which I alluded to earlier. It divides its coverage between popular and scholarly attractions. This mass appeal approach is typical of film advertising in this period. The two-pronged approach is conveyed in the title and subtitle or tagline it gives the film. So we've got Richard III and then the Hunchback King, representing it as half scholarly and half popular horror film. In order to appeal to a more scholarly clientele, it urges theatres to approach schools with a draft letter of introduction, assuring educators that the film retains the original wording and that there is no over-romanticizing nor sentimentalizing, that it provides a reading, the press book also provides a reading list of books on medieval history, and it even claims additional authenticity through its choice of cast, referring to Derek Prentice, who plays the first bishop, whose family seat, Mostyn Hall, was where, and this is a quote, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, took refuge and escaped from Richard III's men on the eve of the Battle of Bosworth Field. This attempt at historical credibility is a feature of press books of the Hollywood Golden Age, with promoters looking for any connection to the real thing. Some examples are a distant relative of Robert Louis Stevenson is featured in the press book of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The creation of striking physical similarities between Merle Oberon and Emily Bronte in Wuthering Heights is noted in 1939 press book. And some press books actually bring in so-called distinguished authors to authenticate the quality and the authenticity of the adaptation, such as using Hugh Walpole as screenwriter and a commentator on the adaptation of David Copperfield in 1935. But going back to Richard III, this draft letter to school heads included in the Richard III's press book contains the claim that it will help aid a histrionic appreciation, seemingly unwittingly confusing the historical with the melodramatic, the real person with the excessively theatrical adaptation. I think it's just a mistake that the author didn't understand what histrionic was. But the marketing strategy is to present contradictory, unique selling points, aiming at all possible audiences, simultaneously authenticating and de-authenticating Olivier's adaptation of Shakespeare's Richard III. And it can be seen, if you like, as histrionic in both its excessive authenticating and de-authenticating of the film. So the film's cultural reach, with the anti-hero directly addressing the camera, has been the subject of a Shakespeare and Beyond blog by Austin Titchener, which is posted on the Folger Library website. And with the help of media followers, Titchener sees Olivier's Richard popping up in the House of Cards, especially the direct addresses to the camera in both the British and American series. And in Heath Ledger's disfigured Joker, Lord Farquaad from Shrek, Alan Rickman's Severus Snape in Harry Potter. One of my favorites is the Richard III ward in Monty Python's Hospital for Overacting. You see that on the left-hand side of the screen. There's a hospital room which just contains people who are acting Richard III in the style of Olivier. And what I find even more remarkable, is that Olivier's Richard is so frequently cited in historical accounts of the monarch. News stories, for example, of the excavation of Richard were frequently accompanied by clips from the Olivier film. A nod towards Olivier's portrayal is the closest thing we have to the original, but also possibly an unintentional admission that Richard III is fake news. And I did a Google search for Richard III a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was interesting that I just Googled the King in the Car Park, and among all the images that I got, Olivier popped up. And looking at kind of news stories at the time of Richard's discovery, you can see that Olivier features in The Guardian, and he's also a feature of A Real Truth History. And I did a search yesterday to see if it was still true that Olivier was still the prevalent Richard III. And I just Googled News Richard III, and this is what popped up. 14 out of 31 of the first images are from Olivier's film, which is quite remarkable. So why is the Olivier film such an enduring adaptation? It's a key development in the Richard III franchise, or in the merchandising of the king. It successfully makes Shakespeare's adaptation of history even more extreme. Richard is more audaciously villainous, and he is also a star performer. The adaptation positions itself not just within the context of the biopic, which tends to romanticize and dramatize the past, but within a 400+ year culture, which simultaneously, unapologetically heroizes and demonizes with little regard for the truth. The biopic genre and the historical portrayals of Richard, on close inspection, are remarkably similar. Commercially successful bioadaptations are two-faced. As promoters of these films in the first half of the 20th century reveal, they claim to be looking backward and to be looking forward. They claim to be historically accurate and historically false. They unashamedly contradict themselves. Like a good mid-20th century film advertisement, his commercially successful adaptations of this vintage, or those that aim for profit, appeal to every possible audience, those that wish for historical accuracy and those who want to be entertained and forget history. The oxymoronic term fake news, something that is both true and false. So fake suggests falsehood, news suggests truth. That term is an apt description of the strategic profiteering or adaptation of text, but even more so of real people. So I'm just going to conclude by going back to my project. And I'm hoping, with the help of a team of research assistants, to produce a film montage documenting the changing representations of Richard, involving places, portraits, fictional recreations, performances, and artifacts. I'm going to conduct a survey based at the King Richard III Visitor Centre, which will try to uncover what it is about the monarch that attracts people to him. What are his USPs, both today and over the 500 years since his demise? I'd also like to find out when approaching Richard from an archaeological and an adaptational perspective can yield, combining the quest for the real Richard and the celebration of his various transformations. And we also be looking, of course, at how disability is being readapted over 500 years through looking at the various iterations of the king. And I'll stop here and just to say, yeah, I just have another image which I forgot to bring up of a news item from Channel 4 when Richard was announced as having been discovered. In the background was a film of Olivier's Richard III on, you know, again, juxtaposed with the skeleton, suggesting that Olivier is the enduring image that we have of Richard. And just to conclude briefly again, there's not a lot written on adaptations of real people. And I've just got a short list of things that you might want to refer to. And I'll finish here. I'll try to work out how to stop sharing my screen and take any questions you might have.